Welcome everyone to the second annual Music and Sound Interest Group Sound Table. Thanks for joining us this evening or afternoon for our presentations. Let me announce at the outset two things. First, unfortunately, Louise Menches was not able to join us for today's event, but I know many of us have been inspired and challenged by her ethnographic example, and I hope we can continue this conversation with her at some other time. I also want to advertise we've had a technical glitch with the program so that the Music and Sound Interest Group business meeting is not showing up when you search music and sound. That's going to take place tomorrow, Friday, from 12:15 to 1:30 in Marquette 9 on the second floor of the Hilton. So I encourage, if you're interested in this panel, please come to our business meeting. That makes it sound really dull, but I don't think it'll be too dull. So please come along. So I wanted to get us started off by saying just a few words about the Music and Sound Interest Group and then a little bit more about our topic today. The aim from the start for the group has been to create a space at the AAAs for ethnomusicology and anthropology to reestablish a sustained conversation, to invite ethnomusicologists and other scholars of music and sound to engage in conversation in this space, the AAA space, and to foster anthropological scholarship on music-related questions and sound studies, work that's truly been flourishing for some time now. The Sound Table idea was conceived by myself and Ellen Gray about 2 years ago as a way to use the interest group's invited session to create an actual dialogic space, a venue for this cross-disciplinary domain to take some conversational shape. So we also sponsor 2 other panels each year. That really helped, Laura. I appreciate it. Okay, so. So the Sound Table idea was conceived by myself and Ellen Gray about 2 years ago. But there are these other 2 more formal panels that the Music and Sound Interest Group sponsors, so we've retained those as a space to do more traditional panels, but we really wanted to encourage conversation and discussion in a kind of regular way and a kind of a structured way. So please join into the discussion and conversation afterwards. This room is not right for that, but we might move forward to the front of the stage and ask you to move in. We'll find a way to make that work. Okay. So this year we've sought to explore ongoing work in the anthropology of music and sound that concerns itself with questions of race and racialization. Our thinking began with the proposition that research on music and sound has been a central pillar for contemporary and historical understandings of race and processes of racialization. Work on sound in a broader sense has contributed to our understanding of processes of circulation across the Black Atlantic, allowed us to hear racializing ideologies and the origins of phonography, and provided critical purchase and a cautionary perspective on the naturalization of the post-human moment. I think it's fair to say, as we do in the abstract, that recent years have seen a flourishing of work that approaches questions of race and racialization from the ground of sound, and this roundtable centers this renaissance, featuring some of the key scholars involved in this work. The sample questions that we put to the panel as we were organizing included, how do we approach the voice as a site of racialized identification, distinction, alterity, or provocation? How do music and sound direct analysis to spatial dimensions of race and racialization? How might conceptual equipment developed in the study of sound allow analysis not just of the naturalization of race, but also the racialization of nature? And how might multinationalism and post-human analytics complicate these heuristic dichotomies? In short, what does the study of sound offer the study of race? And conversely, how does the study of race and racialization let insight into our understanding of music and sound? So that's the deep background, but I feel like I couldn't introduce this panel without noting that we are living in what the Wanyi Australian author Alexis Wright might term untidy times unfolding dangerously. At a moment in which disparate experiences of policing and police violence have been made manifest in their mediation and amplified in our awareness of them, amplified through organizing and movements to protect and advocate for Black communities. We're also on the cusp of a new presidential cycle, in a moment in which white nationalism has a new kind of visibility, a moment with potentially enormous ramifications for people here in the US, certainly, but across the globe as well. Ramifications that will be unevenly distributed and that we can bet will be heavily consequential. So there are, that's to say, what I might call local reasons with broad ramifications that overdetermine and in fact demand this focus on race and racialization where they meet music and sound. So with those few comments, I hope I didn't go on too long, let me begin by introducing our first speaker. Maureen Mann is an associate professor of music at New York University. Maureen's first monograph, Right to Rock, The Black Rock Coalition and the Cultural Politics of Race, was published in 2004 with Duke University Press. And she's completing her second book now, also with Duke University Press, titled Beyond Brown Sugar, Voices of African American Women in Rock and Roll, 1953 to 1984. Her work has been published in Ethnomusicology, Women in Music, a journal of gender and culture, and Journal of the American Musicological Society, among other places. Today, Maureen's presentation is titled Soul Sisters, Race, Gender, and African American Women's Voices in Rock. So please, let's welcome Maureen Mann.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Yay. How you doing? Tough times. So it's good to gather in tough times. And I want to start by thanking Danny Fisher, Kimberly Marshall, and Christina Jacobson for organizing a panel that focuses attention on the ways in which the unique sound of individual voices issuing from specific bodies have meaning in cultural, social, and political spaces. For my comments today, I draw on my current research that Danny just mentioned for a book that traces the undeniable but usually overlooked sonic presence of African American women in rock. My purpose in writing this book is to expand the ways we think about the sound of rock music and to mark the participation of Black women in an art form and musical culture to which they are not typically linked. I want to expand the ways we think about African American women as cultural producers and to give some consideration to the simultaneous presence of Black women in rock and their absence in most critical and historical representations of the genre. This project has led me to a daily reckoning with the relationship between bodies and voices in the West, specifically in the United States and Great Britain. I have been tracing the ways ideas about African American women's voices and ideas about African American women's bodies have interacted in the context of rock and roll. I am particularly interested in exploring the ways African American women artists have navigated the dynamics of race, gender, and power as professional artists, and in considering the opportunities and restrictions that they encountered. This afternoon, I want to talk about these issues in relation to understandings of a Black woman's singing voice. I have that in quotation marks in the text. And this concept of a Black woman's singing voice emerged in the United States and Great Britain during the late 1960s and early 1970s. I want to discuss two musical examples that reveal how race, a category that assigns meaning to human bodies, is captured in and communicated through voice. Here, I want to draw attention to the ways social identity and relations of power inform and emerge through musical performance. Further, I want to think about the meanings associated with these musical voices and music-making bodies. In the performance-centered approach that I'm using, I hear music not as an object, but as a practice realized through the embodied actions of real people operating in real time. I think of my research as being not on music, but rather about musicians and music making, particularly the historical and social contexts in which these processes occur, and the power dynamics that shape the ways people make music and meaning. So I want to share, we're trying to keep our comments short, so I want to share just two contrasting examples to illustrate the ways race, gender, and vocal sound intersect in rock and roll. Oops, sorry, we're at the very beginning of a talk. And I think you're seeing another talk. Okay, this was the title that was supposed to be up 5 minutes ago. First example demonstrates the presence of African American women as background vocalists on rock recordings in the late 1960s and early 70s, when women such as Mary Clayton, Clyde King, Vanetta Fields, Gloria Jones, and a host of others brought an African American gospel sound to rock. This practice was recently made more audible by the Oscar-winning documentary 20 Feet from Stardom. To give a representative example, I'm going to play a short segment of the song Tumbling Dice, a single from the Rolling Stones' now classic 1972 album Exile on Main Street. It features the Stones' lead vocalist Mick Jagger with the two women you see pictured here, Clyde King and Vanetta Fields, on background vocals. Okay, so at one level, the sound of black women's voices in a rock context dominated by British and European American male vocalists offered a jolt of sonic energy as the women's vocals, typically described as soulful, enriched the sound and expanded the sonic spectrum of the recordings they contributed to. They carried into these recordings the energy, emotion, and musicality of audible blackness that indexed authenticity for many listeners, black and white. In addition to the musical novelty, romanticized notions of black identity and black sound, rooted in Western philosophical binaries, fueled the attraction of these black women's voices, or to these black women's voices. Among these stereotypes are the idea that black Americans had a special capacity for authentic musical expression and privileged access to emotion, spirituality, and sexuality, all of which were understood to be absent from or lacking in white people. African American women's gospel-inflected, soulful voices indexed authenticity and unadulterated emotion, unhindered by white middle-class notions of propriety. This was the sound of a racialized, non-Western other. The musical contrast between black and white voices paralleled a social contrast between black and white cultures. The fashion of including these vocalists was a boon to African American women who were able to sustain themselves economically and develop respected professional profiles by working as backup singers, bringing black vocal sound to rock. Their vocal power gave them a measure of professional power, but they were limited in the rock context, in part because their vocal uniqueness was framed not simply as an individual asset, but as an element of group identity, a universalized black woman's sound that all black women were presumed to possess. I now turn to my second example and introduce an artist who departed from the expected style of vocal production of African American women during this era. Betty Davis, an audacious singer-songwriter, launched her solo career in the early 1970s. Davis was influenced by black rock pioneers Jimi Hendrix and Sly Stone, and she connected herself to the blues rather than the gospel tradition. The music she wrote and her vocal approach departed from what black women were expected to produce. Here is an example from her self-titled first album from 1973. The section I'm going to play comes about halfway through the song, Game Is My Middle Name. We'll hear Betty Davis with her background vocalists, the Pointer Sisters and future disco star Sylvester.
Yeah, yeah,
Brian, could you turn the sound down? Thank you. So in this segment, Davis does not provide the vocal ornamentation, melisma, and vibrato associated with African American gospel singing and the desired black woman's voice. As she holds notes almost to her voice's breaking point, shifting from singing to wailing to a raspy, untethered scream, she sounds more like a punk precursor than a soul sister. It's telling that she did not describe herself as a singer. Speaking to an interviewer in 1975, she explained, quote, "Aretha Franklin is a singer. I consider myself more of a projector. I'm into sound. Like, I'll work my voice 1,000 different ways. I'm into making my voice work with the rhythm track. Whatever feel I'm getting from the rhythm track, I'll do it with my voice," end quote. In creating her different and distinctive vocal sound, Betty Davis refused the musical and ideological work that black women's voices typically did in rock songs of the era. She is providing neither soulful comfort nor spiritual warmth. Furthermore, as a woman declaring that game is her middle name, she projects a forthright and self-determined sexuality. She is resolutely not an object for a man's pleasurable consumption, but a woman willing and able to assert her subjectivity and desires. In the end, the reach of Davis's experimental funk rock was limited, in part because her unique voice did not meet dominant expectations of black women's vocal sound. She accepted the defeat, quitting the business at the end of the 1970s. And I think I'm at time, so I'll just end there with those two examples. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Maureen. Our next speaker is Professor Jesse Shipley. You're going to do it from here? No, I'm going to go up there. You're going to go up there? Yeah. Jesse is a professor of African and African American Studies at Dartmouth. Many of you will know his first monograph, Living the Hip Life, Celebrity and Entrepreneurship in Ghanaian Popular Music, published with Duke University Press. He's also a filmmaker, and in addition to a series of shorts and a feature documentary, also titled Living the Hip Life, his new film titled Is It Sweet? Tales of an African Superstar in New York is forthcoming from Third World Newsreel. Today, Jesse's remarks are titled Afropop and Racialization.
All right, cool. Thank you all for coming. This is great. We got this nice big space. I'm going to talk about 3 examples. I want to link them around a theoretical set of principles. I'm going to play a few sounds of music, and I'm going to play it through here on this mic so you can kind of get a gritty sense. That wasn't on purpose, but that's always a good thing. So obviously, also, we can't have this conversation without thinking about what's going on politically right now. And I was trying to think and rethink what I was going to do for this panel in light of sort of the politics and the violence, sort of racial and sexual violence that this election is premised on. And so, to me, this panel and this talk in particular are linked around thinking about how blackness gets appropriated in various kinds of ways, and the kind of claims on blackness, and that popular music, African-American popular music, American popular music, and global popular music rely upon a certain idea of blackness and its contested nature. And I also have multiple titles for this paper, so in the spirit of a kind of polysemous kind of sensibility. One title is Afropop and Racialization. Another is Black Noise, a few thoughts on commodifying sound, racializing violence, African music, and the rising significance of Nigerian sound. And the other one is, or is African music black music? I'm particularly interested in the rise of African commercial popular music industries that have relied upon the development of a particular kind of particularly Nigerian musical sound. Various eclectic rhythmic traditions and lyrical flows have been condensed into simple, repeatable, catchy pop songs. Across Africa and around the world, a sound and order of making and listening to music has evolved in the past 5 years, built upon this production style of Nigerian studios, artistry, and a rising set of listening publics in Nigeria, Africa, and increasingly around the world. But African popular musics have been in dialogue with African American and other black popular musics from around the world for over a century. So partly what I'm interested in, what's different about what happens with African pop right now. Also, recently American pop music, hip hop and R&B, have begun to incorporate African artists and popular sounds into their sort of more mainstream sound. And finally, there's something interesting happening in the American industry where First and second generation African artists are becoming commercially successful in the US, Canada, the UK, and Europe. And we see that with a number of examples that we'll get to in a second. The music's popularity is built, all this music's popularity is built on the production of racial categories through sound. The music both challenges and reinforces forms of violence that come through racialization. Contemporary pop around the world requires that the making of genres rely upon stereotypic ideas of blackness. This occurs first through the links between race and commodification, and second, through the links between race and territoriality. So in a very general, abstract, theoretical sense, I want to argue that musical texts and context are mutually produced. Sound becomes music, and pop music in the US and around the world framed around various appropriations, claims, and counterclaims to blackness. Contexts become places of musicality, enclaves in which music marks identity, whether they are production spaces or live shows or prominently social media technologies framing private listening and user-generated context for self-imagining and for group formation. So the kind of three examples that I'm trying to think about are, first of all, the sort of rise of this contemporary Nigerian popular sound, which now we see permeating all sorts of things. And partly what's interesting to me in the last 5 years is why this didn't happen earlier. You see these other moments of earlier convergence of African artists drawing on African American forms, Afro-Caribbean forms. So we think about Ike and Tina Turner, who are performing at Soul to Soul in Accra in the early 70s, along with Santana and a whole set of artists. And the rise of Afrobeat, Afropop, and Afrofunk, Fela Kuti being the most sort of prominent example. But artists of a certain generation drawing on and in dialogue with James Brown and other artists are not necessarily crossing over. Hip-hop in the 1980s and 90s in Africa, and electronic music in the 1980s and 90s in Africa is a genre that kind of evolves in a really interesting way, crosses over to some extent, but gets caught in a lot of ways in the conundrums of kind of racial stereotype. Hip-hop in Africa, a lot of African artists were seen as being too American if they tried to sound like hip-hop, and frankly, American audiences didn't want to hear what they thought maybe should be from Brooklyn coming out of Lagos or Accra or Dakar. So this interesting kind of dichotomies revolve around people's recognition or misrecognition of genre. If it's African music, it has to be traditional, or it has to sound a certain way. It has to represent a certain kind of Africanness. And that racial categories kind of complicate that for artists and audiences. So we see that happening. The artists 10 years ago start to think about, well, how do we cross over and start to come up with a new formula? So this kind of Nigerian sound condenses a lot of different things into a very simple form, something that's catchy, that spreads across Africa and then into other music industries. Similar moment, something's going on with people like, well, Akon earlier, but Kanan, Wale, The Weeknd, Blitz the Ambassador, Dizzy Rascal, Tinky Strider, Tiny Tempa, Fuse, artists who are like first generation or second generation who kind of make it in the mainstream to some extent, or at least make it in a certain kind of musical realm, but not because they're African. In fact, mostly because they don't claim an Africanness as a part of their music. If they include some sensibility of place, it's sort of incidental, or it's after they become famous. People don't know Akon is from West Africa, from Senegal, until after he's made it. So there's something interesting going on there. They have to claim a kind of blackness which is in complicated dialogue with Africanness. And now finally, the thing that we see sort of in the mainstream is Beyonce, of course, invoking all these Nigerian artists across various genres. Drake doing a collaboration with Wizkid. Fuse in the UK doing collaborations with Wyclef and Sean Paul. All these kind of collaborations and sensibilities that are moving back and forth and creating a way in which African music is entering into other kinds of genres, but is kind of negated in a certain kind of way. And African artists struggle with this. If they come to the US, they have to claim a different sensibility. They can't be African artists, they often say. It aligns with something that many first-generation Africans have said about, well, I didn't identify or wasn't seen or didn't see myself as black until I came to the US, and then suddenly I'm put in these kinds of categories. So the point being a general way in which music and sound and categorization of sonic sort of landscapes points to the kind of violence of racial categorization, particularly when it enters into a kind of commodified realm. Let me just play a couple of pieces of sound to get us something. Should we plug it in? Cool. Yeah. All right, just to give us a little sound. So so this is Positive Black Soul from Senegal with KRS-One, a collaboration from 1997. Let's see how this sounds.
atmosphere. KRS-One, PBS everywhere. Come down! Con have a team of the bacha. You put over like the leader, and I call her. The money secretary, the money Bakama, Bulma, the money Danuma, that's it. Jolly, so that's a little one. Jolly, positive black and muffin. Jolly, so that's a little one. Jolly, I want to get it up in it.
So Positive Black Soul in Senegal and Reggie Rockstone in Ghana, 1990s kind of avant-garde hip-hop. They're in some ways trying to link up to global forms of hip-hop and rap and blackness, and they gain some popularity but are not the commercial success that we see now. This is Reggie Rockstone sampling Fela Kuti. This is also 1995, 1996, Aya Moderna. You can hear the Fela beat. So hip-hop that was trying to blend different genres and trying to play with the category and particularly play explicitly with Pan-Africanism. A couple other quick examples and then I'll close. I wanted to contrast, this is Drake, One Dance, which is featuring WizKid, recent huge hit. On this YouTube hit alone has 270 million views.
Grips on your waist, from way back way. You know that I don't play. Streets not safe, but I never run away, even when I'm away. OT, there's never much love when we go OT. I pray to make it back in one piece. I pray.
This is WizKid doing his own kind of sound, just so you can contrast it. This is WizKid featuring Femi Kuti, Fela's son. And finally, this is Yemi Alade with the infectious hit Johnny. Huge hit. Here it's got 55 million listens.
Yemi Alade, it's a species, baby. Johnny leave me for no Cynthia, and I don't know what to do. I need to say I don't do like the way Cynthia they do. Johnny give Uche belle, talk say you want marry nene, walk him kedi feneme. Johnny Mo.
All right, and finally, just contrast that with.
My children, both living and dead, rest in peace, my true love, who I took for granted, most bomb pussy, who because of me sleep evaded. Her shroud is lone. Fingers up, I ain't thinking about you. I ain't sorry, you. I ain't sorry, you. I ain't sorry, I ain't thinking now. I ain't sorry, I ain't sorry, I ain't sorry, no.
I wanted to show those contrasts in some ways to show, in some ways what's interesting is that the Nigerian sound is becoming something that's mainstream but is not necessarily recognized as such in the US, blending into what's become called Afrobeats in the UK and now has become something ubiquitous. But the ways in which these things then are about the possibility of conversations around race, at the same time the kind of erasure and the kind of violence of racialization that's always underlined popular music, even when it isn't explicitly about race. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse. Our next speaker is Nina Aychan. Nina is a professor of musicology at UCLA. Her book, Sensing Sound, is published with Duke University Press, and she is also co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of Voice Studies. She's also currently completing a second monograph titled Measuring Race, the Micropolitics of Listening to Vocal Timbre and Vocality in African American Popular Music. Today, Nina's presentation is titled The Acousmatic Question. Who is this?
Just wondering, what's the clicker for the slides? Which one is? Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, it's this one? Okay, and which one is the button? The green is the button? Green. Oh, okay, okay, it's forward, okay. Got it. Okay. So, my current project deals with the production of racial categories through vocal timbre. So we're going from sound to vocal timbre. But really, I think it's really about the production of race through listening. And in this project, I'm going to contrast a bit with these papers. I'm not going to play you any examples. But the examples that I work with in this project is thinking about how is it that Billie Holiday's artistry is often just reduced to a sound of a tragic life. How is it that Jimmy Scott, who insisted on his heterosexual identity and lived it throughout his life, was insisted on being heard as a woman, as a child, as a queer, as deaf? And how was it that Marian Anderson, the first African-American opera singer to sing at the Metropolitan Opera, was heard distinctly as an African-American or as a black opera singer, not as just as an opera singer? And how is it that vocal synthesis is racialized? So I'm not going to play those examples, but I want you to know that those were the examples I have been listening to and been thinking through. Whether the vocalizer is heard over the radio or phone, as part of a movie soundtrack, or in person, positioned far away and therefore hard to see, or speaking right in front of the listener, the foundational question asked in the act of listening to a human voice is, who is this? Who is speaking? Regardless of whether the vocalizer is visible or invisible to the listener, we are called into positing this most basic question, a question of acousmatic nature. This specific term, originally connected with the concept of musique acousmatique, originates with the electronic music composer Pierre Schaeffer, deriving the term's root from an ancient Greek legend that describes Pythagoras' disciples listening to him through a curtain. Schaeffer defined it as, let's see if I can do this. Oh, I forgot. What happened? 4. Back is red. Oh, here we go. It's so difficult not to have it in front. Okay. Acousmatic, adjective, referring to a sound that one hears without seeing the causes behind it. While the circumstances of the severing of the sound and the source vary, the impetus behind asking the question is the same. The acousmatic question arises from the assumption that in asking it, it's possible to elicit an answer. If I ask it, I can get a correct answer. It is assumed that if I listen carefully to a sound, if I'm an excellent listener, if I'm a musicologist or ethnomusicologist or anthropologist, in the absence of a visually presented or otherwise known sound, I should be able to identify the source. The acousmatic situation arises from the assumption that voice and sound are of an a priori stable nature, something we can know, and that we can identify degrees of fidelity to or divergences from this state. For instance, man, woman, child, live or recording. I hear the voice of a man, I hear the voice of a woman. This is live, this is recorded. This position is grounded in a belief, really a truth claim, about voice as a cue to interiority, essence, and unmediated identity. In contrast to that position, I posit that the reason we ask, who is this, when we listen to voices is precisely that we cannot know the answer to that question. Indeed, in my forthcoming book, Measuring Race, I argue that we ask it not because a possible ontology of vocal uniqueness will deliver us to the doorstep of an answer, but precisely because of voice's inability to be unique. Adriana Cavarero's classic formulation regarding vocal uniqueness, a human voice, is a unique voice that signifies nothing but itself. For Cavarero, the voice is the vital and unrepeatable uniqueness of every human being. Oh, and this is the citation. While I'm sympathetic to the project of listening intently as a humanizing endeavor, in contrast to Cavarero, what I identify as listening through the acousmatic question arises from the impossibility that this question, the acousmatic question, who is this, will yield a firm answer. So then we might ask, what does the acousmatic question offer insight into? Why am I even dealing with it? When I hear a voice, and my response to that acousmatic question is, as I said earlier, this is a man, this is a woman, this is an Asian woman, this is a black person, a black opera singer. We're not indeed capturing something about an essential voice or person. Instead, we're overlying an individual assumption about what we hear onto the apparent source of what we heard. To understand this overlapping that leads to misjudgment, we need to look more closely at what I call 3 correctives about voice. And I'm going to just talk about them quite briefly here. These are the 3 interrelated corrections. And they're corrections to this voice as unique model. So voice is not singular, it is collective. Voice is not innate, it is culture. Voice's source is not the singer, it is the listener. So first, voice is not singular, it is collective. The voice is not a distinct entity, but rather part of a continuous material field. So-called physical individual voice, then, is part of a continuum, a concentration of energy that we interpret and define as a distinct voice. The voice is composed of a collection of bodily organs that are involved in vocal production, the acoustical condition in which it is emitted and sensed, the style and technique involved in its lifetime of training, what Farah Jasmine Griffin calls cultural style. No one part of this collection of styles and techniques involves race essentially or entails the uniqueness of the speaker. It is rather a performance of cultural style. With the performance of the cultural style of, say, whiteness, comes the assumption that any such traits are either expression of essence or false performances thereof. It is this deep-seated belief that is expressed in the observation that Obama talks white. There would be no reason to make such point were there not underlying assumptions regarding the sound of whiteness and about which bodies has the right to perform such sonorities. Moreover, the voice is not singular or unique, in part because it's not a static organ. It is not an isolated and distinct entity. Instead, it is shaped by the overall physical environment of the body, the nutrition it has access to or of which it is deprived, the harmful particles inhaled or the fresh air enjoyed. Vocal tissue, mass, musculature, and ligaments renew and are entrained in the same way as the rest of our bodies. Research and knowledge about the body, which shows how it is a result of its overall environment, also apply to the part of the body that is the voice. Because we're often focused on the sound and assume that there is an unchanging relationship between the entity we believe to be a static, distinct human and the vocal sound we hear, we also assume that the voice is intrinsic and unchangeable. However, just as the body possesses different qualities, or is able to carry out different activities depending on how it's been nurtured and conditioned, so too the voice is an overall continuation and expression of the environment in which it participates. Second, in this way, voice is not an innate, it is culture. Vocal choices are based on the vocalizer's position within the collective rather than arising solely as an individual expression. Vocal communities share an invisible and often unconscious and inexplicable synchronicity of vocal movements and vocal performance, gravitationally attracted by the dynamics of the culture in which the vocalizer participates. This takes place, for example, through the vocal body's movements, habituated by practice, proprioception, listening, and the specific practices adapted to and expressing a given culture's ideal. Speakers or singers do not use the entire range of their voice's infinite timbral potentialities. None of us do. In other words, the decisive factor in honing each voice's potentiality and developing expertise in the timbral area is not only individual preference, but rather collective pressure and encouragement to sound in the way that is expected. What we conceive of as a single voice, then, is a manifestation of a given culture's understanding of the vocalizer and his or her role within that culture. That is, voice is a manifestation of a shared vocal practice. Third, as we've already begun to see, the voice does not arise solely from the vocalizer. It is created just as much within the process of listening. This means that the voices heard are ultimately identified, recognized, and named by listeners at large. This is a man, this is a woman, this is an Asian woman. This means that the voices heard are ultimately identified, recognized, I'm repeating myself, and named by the listeners at large. In hearing a voice, one also brings forth a series of assumptions about the nature of voice. The speech chain, the now ubiquitous model of voice conceived by linguists Peter Dennison and Elliot Pinson, includes two general areas: the speaker and the listener. An information transmission from the speaker to the listener can be condensed into the following parts: the speaker's brain, motor neurons, sound generation, the listener's ear, the listener's brain. This model usefully expanded the previous model of speech by considering speech in the context of communication instead of two distinct and separate processes. As Dennis and Pinson outlined, the speech chain is incomplete without the listener. I will go one step further in suggesting that the listener, including both other listeners and all the listeners, myself listening to myself, is so strong and indeed so overriding that in order to understand the process of evaluating and defining vocal timbre and voices, it is more useful to consider the process from the listener's point of view. And I can flip the directionality of the speech chain, calling it the listener voice chain, and with the listener as the focal point. This is because, on the one hand, actual vocal output is determined by the speaker's listening to his or her own voice and considering how the community hears it, and by the countless concrete instances in which he or, oh my God, she is vocally corrected directly or indirectly by other people. On the other hand, regardless of the actual vocal signal emitted, the listener will produce their own assessment of what they did hear. So we assign value when we pose and respond to the acousmatic question. And in societies built on racial difference, those values include race. So what I want to conclude with saying then is that the reason I think the acousmatic question is very useful is not because by asking who is this, I'm able to identify who that is. But I shift the question. I shift the question not to say, who is this speaking, but I shift the question to say, who am I who hears this person speaking, and have these ideas about this person conjured in my mind and overlay that onto that person's voice. This is a man's voice, this is a woman's voice, this is an Asian woman's voice, this is a black opera singer's voice. Thank you.
Nina, thank you. Our fourth and last speaker this afternoon is Kwame Harrison. Kwame is Associate Professor of Anthropology at Virginia Tech. His 2009 monograph, Hip Hop Underground, The Integrity and Ethics of Racial Identification, is published with Temple University Press. As with our other speakers, Kwame has also been published widely, and his research can be found in the Journal of Pan-African Studies, Journal for the Society of American Music, Collaborative Anthropologies, and elsewhere. Today, Kwame's remarks for us are titled Sounds of Blackness in Hip-Hop Music.
Great. Thank you. I don't have any, I had some sounds, but I'm not going to give you those sounds. I wrote too much, so I'm going to move through it quickly. But first, I just want to thank all the organizers of the panel and just tell you and thank everyone for coming out and say what an honor it is for me to be a part of this panel. I've been a big fan and inspired by Jesse's work and Maureen's work, and just last week I was giving a paper on ad-libs and just touching into some of Nina's work. Just getting my foot into it a little bit has really opened up a lot of my thinking about that. But today I'm talking about sounds of blackness, so to move in. My path into hip-hop studies begins with the fact that throughout the 1980s and 1990s, I was an avid hip-hop music fan. And I cultivated that fandom in no small part because during the period when I was first introduced to hip-hop, I attended a predominantly white independent school in Western Massachusetts. Thus, hip-hop's incontrovertible blackness, for me, reconciled inconsistencies in my own perceived identity. And it also brought in desires, perhaps misplaced desires, that were fed by the pressing adolescent need to pursue coolness, but desires to embrace my black identity. And at this point, I would have played Sucker MCs or something by Run DMC to just give you a sense of what that sounded like. Nevertheless, when I enrolled at the University of Massachusetts Amherst several years later, the first class I signed up for was an Introduction to African American Studies taught by John Bracey, and I knew I wanted to be an Afro-Am minor long before I knew I wanted to be an anthropology major. At UMass, my familiarity with hip-hop also helped to transform me in the eyes of fellow first-year black students from Springfield, New Haven, and New York, helped to transform me from a cornball kid who they suspected hadn't heard anything about Eric B. and Rakim or Boogie Down Productions into someone who was worth getting to know. And over 25 years later, although I don't get to the Northeast as much as I'd like, the four of us, Springfield, New Haven, Brooklyn, and Shelburne Falls, Massachusetts, still consider each other brothers. To my sociology colleagues back at Virginia Tech, and I am an anthropologist in a sociology department, hip-hop's association with blackness is best represented by people who listen to it. And it may be true that collectively identifying black people disproportionately like hip-hop more than any other racially defined group. But this doesn't supersede the fact that in the United States, hip-hop and rap music has many more non-black consumers, and particularly white consumers. Sociologists, especially those who subscribe to a production of culture approach, might explore hip-hop's blackness through those people who make hip-hop. But as my own research in the San Francisco Bay Area shows, more and more, particularly at the independent level, hip-hop music making is done by people of all races. Indeed, hip-hop's blackest productive spaces, and I'm talking about a non-geographic arena, those productive spaces where you might find the highest proportion of black artists would probably be the highly commercialized strata that gets called the capital M, capital I music industry. Considering these 2 points in tandem, the marketability of blackness as a commodity may continue to be one of the strongest and most intriguing areas of research, and particularly how that's connected to how black bodies get policed. A third sociological route to explore hip-hop's musical blackness might be to examine the identities that are most associated with hip-hop. Such associations shape the imaginaries of both listeners and those people who are in positions to make decisions about what music gets promoted and how. Developments within both popular music studies and the anthropology of music and sound have encouraged us to develop new questions that go beyond placing hip-hop music in its social and representational context. They encourage us to start with the music in its various iterations and to think about how the music works, what the music does, and to consider the synergistic building blocks, the sounds that comprise hip-hop music and engender the blackness that people hear within it. So to give a tentative nod to Nina's astute contention that often for listeners, non-sonic information influences sonic perceptions, and I think that's very real and we should pay attention to that. Still, I want to start by giving an admittedly selective overview of some of the existing approaches to describing, analyzing, and making sense of hip-hop's black sounds. The logical place from which to begin with this would be Tricia Rose's 1994 book, Black Noise, which essentially founded hip-hop studies. In Black Noise, Rose characterizes hip-hop in all its permutations as embodying flow, layering, and rupture. Rose went on to describe the effect of these qualities, and here we can consider the way music sounds as producing sustained motion or flow, which encounters abrupt or disruptive angular breaks. Her observations align with earlier descriptions of Black musical priorities. For example, anthropologist Zora Neale Hurston, who in her 1930s essay, Characteristics of Negro Expression, emphasized the angularity of Black expressive articulation. Rose also drew parallels with the late Amiri Baraka when she describes rap's, quote, dense configurations of independent but closely related rhythms, end quote, as well as its harmonic and non-harmonic percussive sounds. Indeed, polyrhythmic intensity has endured as a central descriptor of hip-hop's Blackness. In a recent book, Sounding Race and Rap Music, Lauren Kajikawa cites a, quote, lack of rhythmic density and absence of syncopation in Eminem's My Name Is as contributing to its, quote, rhythmic parody of whiteness. So the lack of that signals a whiteness. An additional sonic feature of for Rose is the practice she describes as working in the red, which involves using music technologies in ways that they have not been intended. Quote, by pushing on established boundaries of music engineering, rap producers have developed an art out of recording with the sound meters well into the distortion zone, end quote, thus producing a heavy, dark, growling sound that Rose equates with the sonic sensations such as urgency and awareness. Here I would probably be playing Public Enemy's By the Time I Get to Arizona. I don't know how many people remember that song, but it's in... Neither party is mine, not the jackass or the elephant, is what he says in the song. In his 2000 book, Rap Music and the Poetics of Identity, the late Adam Crims repackages this working in the red affect, underscoring the layering dimensions of a concept he calls the hip-hop sublime, described as a product of, quote, incompatible layers of sound being selectively and dramatically brought into conflict with each other, end quote. Such discordant musical amalgamations, Crim argues, are key to generating potent soundscapes which convey sometimes surprisingly pleasurable senses of menacing aggressiveness, hardness, and realness. I hope we have time to think and talk about some of these characterizations and how they work and why they're there. The organizational principles underlying the hip-hop sublime prioritize, quote, dissonant harmonic combinations and classing timbral qualities, end quote, produced through the practice of utilizing multiple samples from various sources in a polyrhythmic layering effect. Where these examples from Rose and Crim mark a productive treatment of hip-hop's musical sound formations, especially how particular sounds work in conjunction to produce sonic materialities that are in some ways linked to contemporary notions of Blackness, I think it's helpful to pivot from focusing on the content of the sounds that index Blackness and to focus on the performative mode of sounding Blackness. Here I follow the late Stuart Hall's prescient observations that are featured in his essay, New Ethnicities, about a shift from concerns over portrayals of Blackness to concerns over the very fact that Blackness is being represented, how and what it means. Black performance expands, synthesizes, comments on, and responds to imaginations about Black identity. These imaginations then, returning to my third sociological framework, get activated through the way Blackness is represented. So in considering hip-hop sounding of Blackness, it is useful to start from a framework that doesn't seek to locate and index how Blackness sounds, but rather acknowledges the perpetual instability of Black sounding. Such an approach prioritizes how late modern Black music sensibilities, and sensibilities are defined, quote, as, quote, stylized ways of being in relation to each other and our environment, end quote, how these sensibilities embody a consciousness of and urge to enhance and or resist current understandings of Blackness, including how it sounds. Fred Moten describes Blackness as marking, quote, simultaneously both the performance of an object and the performance of humanity, end quote. In what I'm proposing, the object exists as a crystallized form of what represents Blackness at any given moment, representations that as Black people we have to confront and contend with daily. The humanity, in turn, comes from the capacity to transcend what is represented, to revise it, to resist its containment. Trying to capture Black sound in recording then becomes a daunting task because, again, citing Moten, quote, "Blackness is always a disruptive surprise move in which non-fullness, in the rich non-fullness of every term it modifies." Let me say that again. Blackness is always a disruptive surprise moving in the rich non-fullness of every term it modifies, end quote. As such, we must be cognizant of the infinite variations in how Blackness sounds across space, across time, and across texts. Performing Blackness in this light can thus be thought of as a resource for strength, resistance, and unexpected pleasures. In discussing the content of Black sounds in the earlier part of what I was saying, I drew on a lineage of earlier commentators of Black aesthetic priorities like Amiri Baraka and Zora Neale Hurston. In closing, I want to connect this mode of performative, revisionary representation with another Black scholar of an earlier generation who's still with us. My Virginia Tech colleague, Nikki Giovanni, who made what I take to be one of the most compelling statements on the enduring power of Black expressivity. And this, I think, is just an important, has always been an important quote to me, but particularly in these untidy times, so I'll end with this. "We're still here, still laughing, still loving, still deciding what looks good and what sounds right. We're still hugging ourselves, still making joyful noises, still finding a way to be human and humane. It is not, after all, the Blackness that has caused our loss of vision, making us turn and turn in this tunnel of despair. It's the Blackness that's showing us the way out." Thank you.
Thank you, Kwame. Thanks to all our speakers. We thought we would stay true to the roundtable format initially, and I'd like to encourage comments or questions between our presenters, if there are any. At this point, maybe people need to collect their thoughts, that's fine too. Before we open it up to you all for
I can start. Sure. I was taking notes in preparation of this. I guess I'll just start with I'll start with Jesse, but I have notes on all sorts of things. But and this is, I mean, this, I don't know if this is a question, and I don't even know. I'm just kind of throwing myself. It strikes me, and this has to do with what you were talking about, African sounds, but it also, it strikes me, I mean, other things going on. There's the continent it's a new frontier in many ways. And I mean, I know that historically it's subject to colonialism and I mean, it was this space that was colonized, but it seems that something is going on right now. And my example, I'll give an example and then I'll try to say what I might think is going on. My example is the interest universities are taking right now in the continent. The rise of study abroad programs on the African continent. Universities buying land in Africa. And it almost strikes, I mean, the best way, and I probably completely off here, but so it's like there's some sort of a frontier, but it's not the historical frontier of European colonialism of just going out and landing on this place and exploiting the resources. But I see it kind of, I mean, in thinking about it, I almost think it's moving from a very primitive image of what Africa is and how do we, and how can it be colonized and exploited for those resources to now an acceptance of a modern Africa. And my colleagues in Africana studies have been saying for years, people think about Africa and they think about forests and jungles, but it is cities. Most people live in cities. But there seems to be almost an acknowledge of that, but now a different kind of move into those spaces, which again, wouldn't have to do with what we might call traditional music and dancing, but has to do with something very, very new. So I don't know, those were some thoughts I had.
No, I think you're right. Couple of things. One of the ways I was trying to put things together sort of in a very pastiche kind of way is about the changing violence of representation. So this kind of way that Africa's seen, or and the kind of scale of thinking, even the idea of Africa itself. So you look at early American hip hop, and there's a kind of set of references to Africa and Africanness and a kind of reclamation of Pan-Africanism, everything from African Bambaataa, Zulu Nation, to references in, Public Enemy and all these kinds of things, to Diggable Planets. I mean, thinking about Nikki Giovanni references to, and then linking those references to references in Africa. So within hip hop, there's kind of stereotypes about Africa too, as this one place, but a place of positive return, a kind of romanticized positive opposition in a very kind of long tradition of political opposition to racial violence in the U.S. And that's accompanied by the kind of, violence of mainstream representation of Africa, which, as we all know, has this kind of colonial trajectory. So then something is shifting, and in a crass sense, it's a different version of capital. So there's certainly this kind of idea that Africa is a frontier of consumption, of investment, of market, of possibility. And there's a lot going on here, because on the one hand, we're talking about a set of stereotypes about Africa and about blackness that get perpetuated within these musical forms. But part of what I was trying to point out is the mobilities of people and the mobilities that technologies provide of different kinds of sound opens up spaces. So the way that Kendrick Lamar can talk about Africanness, or can talk about an interaction around being in South Africa, the way that we get news about the, Mos Def, former Mos Def, getting arrested for claiming global citizenship in South Africa. The conversations become really nuanced and complicated. The fact that Beyonce has created a conversation about Nigerian artists, about Chimamanda, about, different kind of visual artists, about producers. And then those videos are being remixed in Nigeria, and then other artists are working on those things. So some of it's interesting in this kind of possible ways, and some of it's like big capital. Like I wrote this short piece on MTV Africa, which is a subsidiary of MTV, which is like, okay, cool. Nigerian sound is the marketable sound. So let's sell Nigerian records in Kenya. Let's sell Nigerian records in Tanzania. Let's try and sell them to Francophone countries, right? So it's also this kind of push of big capital. And it's always this kind of tension between these artists kind of pulling things and pushing. The last piece like that I think is interesting, like when African artists would go abroad in the old days, they would pretend they were from Jamaica, or they would pretend they were from Brooklyn. But now they can be like, okay, I'm from Ghana, and that's kind of okay, sort of, like in some contexts. But it's like, it's definitely shifting, and to me, it's about capital. Say, like NYU's buying up Accra. Like, so why? What is about that as a kind of frontier of investment? And that's a big question, but this is a small part of.
I don't have a question, I just have an observation that I think with the papers, maybe with all four of the presentations, there's this, our appeal to or reference to the instability of blackness or black sound, or what that is, what that might be. And then I think in each of the contexts that we were talking about, there's also this fixity of what blackness and black sound are. And so there's this tension that I think we're all aware of. It's something that we see in a lot of cases around when we're talking about social construction, but just that it emerges in the context of black music, race, and racialization. So it's just an observation.
I have at least one for everybody, and then we can open it up, because I don't know how great my questions are. But Nina, I'm thinking about how does, as you were talking about voices and the inability of voices to be unique, I was wondering how language factors into that. And by language, I don't mean the language you speak, but I mean that language is language is something we practice. I mean, our whole lives we are kind of taught these sound signals, and that these sound signals have meaning, and we practice them in a certain way. And there was actually a great paper last week at the Ethnomusicology Conference about Hawaiian Pidgin language. Christina Yano was doing it, and how it was policed through listening. So just how being forced to speak, and I mean having these language which are infinitely youthful, but still we are kind of trained to all model the same signals and the same signals in a certain correct way. So I don't know if that's much. So the question, I guess, is to what extent does language impact, does just the practice of having to speak and learning to speak and really being corrected in practice our whole lives, how does that impact the, I guess, distinction or indistinction in voices? I don't know if that makes
Yeah, no, there. I'm just quiet because there is too much to say. That's why I'm quiet. No, I mean about the everything here. Where to start? Well, I think one of the things I'm trying to point out with my work and about language. I mean, there are people here who are experts in this. I know really nothing about language and speech, but what I know and where I'm trying to not level the field, but create some points of connection is that I think we can accept quite readily that anybody, if they grew up, any body, physical body, if that body, human body, grew up within the language culture, that unless they had some, most people would then learn that language. We all accept that, and that would be their mother tongue, and that person will, of course, learn to produce those sounds, and they will be able to produce those sounds because they can hear them, and by hearing them, they can produce them, and so on. So there are, of course, many other language sounds that we cannot hear. We hear within a certain framework that we have have been socialized. So what I'm trying to say in my work is that this is the same in terms of timbre, and I think that's in timbre, the sound of the voice, so we can have words, but that those words or notes or singing is given forth with a sound, and that's very simply explained is the timbre. The timbre then has been, for at least 2,000 years, in written form, has been understood as the essence of a person, and it's been understood as his uniqueness, and we use that in very positive terms. I hear you. I hear that you are sad, even though you say, I'm okay. So I'm going to let your tone, your timbre, override your verbal, linguistic message to me. So because we have this very close tie between uniqueness, humanness, even the differentiation between human and animal, that's so much attached to the timbre. We have a very hard time, I think, to understand that timbre is learned in the same way as the pronunciation of a word. So it's very complicated, I think, conceptually, that you can recognize me as me. If you know my voice, you'll hear it's me. But at the same time, I'm going to insist that me is part of that continuum that I was trying to outline for you. That if I grew up under a different vocal circumstance, a different listening circumstance, I could still maybe have the same basic sound, but there would be other components too. And if I try to equate it to, or compare it to athletes, so I could be a body lifter. Is that what you call it? No, weightlifter, weightlifter, and I could get that kind of body shape. Or I could be a ballerina and I can get that kind of body shape. It would still be me. I'm not completely changed, but I'm just concentrating on different potentialities of me. So that's the same with timbre, is my argument, basically, my thesis. So it's complicated, that we both want to insist that I recognize you, and it's very important to recognize you, but at the same time, it's important to recognize that you are you in this field of connections and socialities, and you wanting to fit in, and you wanting to perform blackness through hip-hop, or you wanting to perform being a son, perform being a father, perform being a colleague, and so on, right? So we're going to shift in all those roles. And then, of course, we know that some people have many pivots. They can make nearly infinite amounts of pivots. They can perform whichever role they want. And then we know some positionalities have very limited amounts of pivots in terms of roles they can perform. And their voices are going to be limited in those kinds of ways. They start to hear themselves as that. I start to hear myself as a woman. I start to hear myself as so-and-so. So to connect back to you, there is a lot of connection. I think that we need to take in terms of timbre then, I would just take the lessons from language, what we can think about, the way we can imagine that any person can learn any language if they grow up in it, counts for sounding black, sounding white, sounding, X, Y, Z.
I don't have a question for you guys, but I do have and I hesitate, but I'm going to do it anyway, because this is to sociologize something that I don't think is actually very sociological. And that is there's this link I'm hearing between Kwame's paper and Nina's paper, and that link is in Irving Goffman and the On Footing paper, which in that paper, as many of you will know well, he wants to explode the speaker-hearer dyad and to focus on the different ways that there are maybe different positions for listeners and different kinds of, maybe you can parse out the role of speaking. It's been recently used as a pivot to think about the notion of animation and to think about differences between the sounding box of the voice and the animator, the person doing the speaking and the person maybe authoring the speaker. But the other side of that is and this is what I was thinking about, is the authorized listener and the unauthorized listener, and the different kinds of ways in which one might listen. And this is, I'm hearing this coming up in Nina's paper. I'm hearing something of this actually throughout here in the ways that might inflect or be animating race and racialization. This distinction between the listener that is legible, authorized, and the listener that is unauthorized. But with all things Goffman, there's that unauthorized listener may in fact be the target of the speech too. Anyway, don't know questions.
I can shift that into what I was thinking about had to do with genre in a similar sense. What are the ways and what becomes legible and what becomes sort of erased? And I was thinking about that in terms of thinking about the significance and the sort of just the artists that you play for us, and then how do black women's roles in this particular genre, which aren't usually recognized, then erased, or when do they become visible and when do they become invisible? So when do authorized and unauthorized listeners kind of shape what becomes legible or not? And how do these categories then, which are sort of being produced, they're performative in these kinds of moments, how do they reinforce older forms of erasure, and when do they open up possibilities? Like, when does something become legible? So the first two little clips I played were like really kind of like really good hip hop. Like, it's really good rap, really well produced. It's KRS-One performing with Positive Black Soul. It has like 5,000 hits on it. Like, no one listened to this stuff, and it's really great music, but it was kind of illegible to everyone for a set of reasons. Like, people in Dakar and Accra kind of didn't want to hear Africans doing hip hop, and then they sent it to London and New York, and people are like, this sounds great, but is this guy from Staten Island, or what is this? Like, it became illegible in very significant reasons. I think even more significant, the way I wanted to hear maybe more about that, like, how do these women get picked up or not picked up, or how do they imagine their role in the kind of music that they're doing? Because the other thing becomes, like, what kind of voice do you think it is shapes what kind of music you think it is. You might think something is blues or country, and it might sound kind of the same, but it's marked differently, and that's really important. So I don't know.
For the background vocalists, and this is the late 1960s and early 1970s, I think they're able to be successful in part because they're in the background. They're not the stars of the show. Most of the women that I write about in my background vocalist chapter tried to have solo careers as the woman up front, and they weren't successful at that. And the problem was figuring out how they were supposed to sound, and who the audience for that sound was. So they're coming out of gospel tradition, they cross over into secular music. They're singing background for everybody. It's not just white rock musicians, but rock had become the sort of center of energy of the music industry by the end of the 1960s. And so when everyone heard them as really good singers, and so the idea was, okay, they should be able to sing, they should be the stars of the shows. Some people say they're better singers than the people that they're singing with, that they're singing background for. But the problem that I deal with a lot in the work that I do is the racialization of the recording industry and the division of markets into black and white markets. And so the problem that these women face is that they're kind of betwixt and between. So they have racially marked voices, but then they sort of become liminal figures. So they're clearly African American if you look at them. They're singing in an African American style, but that style has now crossed over into the mainstream. So rock and roll is drawing on African American musical practices, but the perceived audience for that music is white. So the recording industry has, from the beginnings in the 1920s, when they started recording African Americans, it's always thought that it has to market black artists to black audiences. They don't perceive marketing black artists to white audiences for the most part, at least to start. You can cross over, but you need to start with a black audience. So one idea was, well, we'll market them to black audiences, except for what are they supposed to sing then? And will what they sing that will be marketable to black audiences be appealing to white audiences who they also should maybe be able to reach because they're working in a white circuit as these background vocalists. So they're just sort of stuck betwixt and between. There is not an example that I can give you of one of these background vocalists who, they're very talented singers who were able to get a hit record, to make a hit record for either market.
Maureen, could I just, one of the things that I was struck by in the example that you played, and I'm not sure how characteristic that is, but in the example, you used the word jolt, like the singing provided a jolt. I kind of saw it, I immediately focused on the mix, and I saw it as almost like the voices were almost like breaking into the song. And in some ways, it was just kind of, like I was just trying to imagine what it looked like. And at first I could just see the Rolling Stones playing, and then these women were, and this gospel sound was just coming in. And I wonder what were the moments in music where voices were kind of really kept in the background, and in what moments were they brought to the foreground in that kind of a way for a particular effect, and if there's anything to that.
One way I can respond is by talking about when having that kind of audible blackness became desirable for white artists, because a background vocalist like Darlene Love, who's an African-American woman who started out in the late 1950s with her group, The Blossoms, she sang with her group background on a lot of recordings by white artists. But this is going along with the kind of questions Nina's asking, but they were told to sound white. So they sang behind the Beach Boys and behind a lot of white pop groups or artists like Doris Day. They're on that Halloween novelty song, whose name just popped out of my head. But they're on a lot of white records, not sounding black. And at the same time, they would sing behind Sam Cooke, and on all of this, many of the Phil Spector records, like girl group music, the Crystals. I think one of the people who starts bringing that black sound into white recordings is Dusty Springfield in England. And then after that point, and especially British artists really wanted to hear, they were already into blackness, they're already in the midst of a blues revival, and they're calling what they're playing rhythm and blues. They don't call it rock. They're really trying, like the Who, for example, a British band from London, talked about what they were doing as maximum R&B, rhythm and blues. They weren't saying we're a rock and roll band. It was really about rhythm and blues. So that's about the 1965, 1966 is when you start to see that happening. And at that point, they want to have that black gospel sound. It's the vocal element that connects to the blues guitar element that they're attracted to. So that's one place that's one way I trace that.
So we're going to come to y'all, and so you can ask questions.